in this historical talk by Dr. Tom Swetnam on the hot springs, hotels, and people of the Jemez. I wanted to introduce the board of the Friends of the Library. I am the president. I am Suzanne Swetnam. The vice president is Laura Finch. Treasurer is Dee Plana, who's been processing everybody's payments and sending out your links. The secretary is Debbie Peterson. We have members at large, Nancy Sulla, Cliff Elliott, Margarita Riley, Judy Schofield, and Lou Ann Webster. And I want to thank each of them for being on this board and helping so very much. And with that, I will have Dr. Swetnam start his talk. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Okay, let me share my screen. The PowerPoint file. Okay, and get started. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining, and thanks for your support to the library too. And I'm really happy to be able to give this presentation about the history of Jemez Springs. It's a hobby for me and a love for me to be able to dig into the past here in the Jemez and to know more about where we're living. And this talk is really just, a small part of the history of Jemez Springs. There's so many more stories that can be told. And maybe we'll tell some of those in the future, and other people will too. But for this talk, I'm going to focus really on the period from the middle 1800s until the early 1800s, in a time that was kind of a boom time for Jemez Springs. It was when tourism really kicked off here. And a number of very interesting people moved here, and there were a number of changes that occurred in the valley. And change is really a kind of a constant here in Jemez Springs, with turnover of people and changes occurring in the houses and what's going on. But there's always some constancy of conditions and people here as well over time. So the focus again is over that more recent period, but I wanted to start by acknowledging the longtime presence of the Jemez people here as well. As many of you know, the Jemez tribal people lived here for centuries, especially after 1300, and they had very large villages, big townhouse structures, more than a dozen of these across the mesa tops, with more than 1,500 rooms in the case of this big ruin on a mesa west of Jemez Springs. And they were here in large numbers, perhaps 8,000 or more people at the time of Spanish contact. And the population crashed after about 1600. There was introduction of diseases, smallpox, and other diseases killed more than 90% of the people. And the Spanish forced the Jemez people off of the mesas and out of the valley. So there were villages in the valley too, as you know. And in the end, the people ended up at Walatoa. So the Jemez people were the original folks here. And here's just a current view of the ruin up on the mesa to the west. But this history that I'm going to talk about specifically starts with the San Diego land grant and the Spanish folks who were here and were granted this land grant in 1798. And there's a list of about 20 families that were included in that land grant. And you can see the land grant, it extended all the way up to, this is called Vallecitos de la Cueva. You probably can't read the wording there, but it's this big box that included the Guadalupe River and the Jemez River over here. And Jemez Springs would be about right here, and Cañones would be about right there. So you'll notice actually on the names too of the land grantees that that includes a lot of familiar names of families that are still here, the Garcias, the Montoyas, and Gonzalez, and Gallegos, Jaramillo, families that are here in the valley, but also in Cañon and Ponderosa and San Ysidro. So this was the beginning, the land grant, but apparently people didn't live there weren't very many people living in the valley proper until probably, I'm guessing, around 1850. And a reason was that there was still quite a lot of raiding going on by the Navajos and the Utes and the Apaches. So we know that they're from a report, and it's probably the first most detailed report and description of the Jemez Valley in the Anglo literature anyway. And that is the trip by James Simpson, Lieutenant Simpson, in 1849. So he was sent from Santa Fe to go to the Navajo lands to do some investigations over there. And on his way over, he stopped off in San Ysidro area, and he took a day trip up to Los Ojos Calientes. That's what he called what's now Jemez Springs, Los Ojos Calientes. And he describes his trip up here, and it's a wonderful report. It has a number of illustrations. Here is one of the Jemez governors of Jemez Pueblo that's in that report from 1849. But in his description, coming up the valley, he described a number of very interesting things. They saw a wolf, and they saw farm fields for 6 or 7 miles up the canyon. So I take that to be from the junction of the Guadalupe up toward Jemez Springs. There were farm fields. However, they were all abandoned for fear of the Navajos. So he went on to say that there had been raiding and that people had been driven out in that period in around 1849 and before. So I'm suspecting that really it was a dangerous place to be up here until probably after 1864, when the Navajos were subjugated by Kit Carson. And until that time, it was really dangerous for people to be here. But there may have been some people here living earlier, but the evidence seems to be limited at this point. What did he see, Simpson see, as he came up the valley? Well, we don't know. We don't have photographs that old, but the next oldest would be this one, probably 1884, the view of the junction of the Guadalupe and the Jemez River. Right there is Guadalupe Mesa in the foreground. And it's really striking how barren it is. There's almost no vegetation, no bosque, no cottonwood bosque, so to speak. And we don't know if there were no cottonwoods along the bottom of the river when Simpson came up. He didn't describe it as a cottonwood bosque. And it may be that a lot of these cottonwoods, the cottonwoods that were there were some, were taken away by fuelwood gathering and also by sheep herding, which was very, very big in the late 1800s. There were large numbers of sheep being run up and down the valley. So here's the modern view of that with the cottonwood bosque that's taken over. So I have a number of photographs. This old photograph is from Cook, Bass, and Robinson. The photograph on the left is a view further up the valley. And again, there's no cottonwood bosque. On the right, you can see the cottonwoods. Cook, Bass, and Robinson, they were photographers out of Socorro, I believe. And they took at least 24, 25 images because they're numbered. And unfortunately, I've only found about 6 of them so far. So there's a number of other great landscape photos out there yet to be found from Cook, Bass, and Robinson of the Jemez Valley. And if anybody has any tips, I'd love to see those. Well, in Simpson's journal, there's all these drawings, and you can tell they're from sketches that were later completed, and they're not very accurate. I mean, you wouldn't recognize this as Jemez Hot Springs right here at the village center, except for there is this is in the center of the view there's the bell tower of the church off in the distance. And there is kind of a little pointed peak out there above the church. So he said there were hot springs, and they actually cooked some eggs and some meat in the hot springs while they were here. And they took another excursion up the canyon to the old mission church, and he described the mission church. So of course, the mission church has long been a subject of photography and description by all kinds of people that have visited Jemez Springs. And here's another Cook, Bass, and Robinson image from 1884 that gives a picture. Now, who knows what it looked like 40 years, 50 years earlier when Simpson was here, but you can see this was before it was restored in the 1930s, and they put the lintel over the main doorway, and they built up the walls a little bit and excavated the main nave of the church. And somebody built a house over here, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more. I think it was probably the house of John Miller, maybe someone else. But here's a list, a chronological list of the place names of Jemez Springs, which tells some of this history of the late 1800s, and beginning with Giosewa, the Jemez Pueblo place name for the village where the old mission church. The old mission church, by the way, its name was San Jose de los Jemez Mission, and this was actually a subject of considerable debate and discussion until maybe 20 or 30 years ago. People didn't know which exactly mission this was. Was it the San Diego mission or the other? There were some other names, but this is the final name that most scholars now agree was what this mission was called. And then there's the name Los Ojos Caliente, which is what Simpson called it in his report. And maybe the Abuselmans knew about this original name, or certainly the local people here knew that this was an old name for this place, Los Ojos Calientes, and that's the origin of the name of Los Ojos Bar, was the name of this place. Well, Jemez Hot Springs is another very common name. It's recorded as Hot Springs on the 1876 Wheeler map, but in many other publications since then, especially newspapers, commonly referred to it as Jemez Hot Springs. And then Archuleta, for a very short while, it was named Archuleta, and it was probably because there was a post office established here, and Juan Archuleta was the postmaster. And so the name of this place was Archuleta for a short while. Then it changed to Perea. So Perea was another gentleman we'll be talking about, and he was a postmaster for a while. And then finally it became Jemez Springs. So you can see these place names on the maps. Here's the corner of the 1876, one of the 1876 maps from the Wheeler survey, and all it says is Hot Springs, and it's got a ruins, so it doesn't say Jemez Hot Springs, it just says Hot Springs. And then here's the 1890 geological survey map with Archuleta, right? So this is Jemez Springs with the red arrow, and actually you might notice this little trail. This is what's known as the Padre Alonso Trail, which still exists. It goes from the old mission church up onto Cat Mesa, and it joined what looks like a road there, but it was an old trail, and it went down into Vallecitos de los Indios, and this is called South Fork back in the day, but now it's called the East Fork, right? And then San Antonio Creek joins the East Fork here, and it becomes the Jemez. So that old map, and then just 2 years later, there's the name Jemez Springs in 1892, right? Okay, so just these old maps are interesting to look at. Vallecitos de los Indios is now known by many folks up here as Sierra Los Pinos, is the name of the development there. But the little valle there is the Vallecitos de los Indios. And La Cueva was known as Vallecitos de la Cueva, right? And then this is where Sulphur Springs area right up here. The old maps tell a lot of the history of this place. So photographs of people are always interesting, and I thank Raymond Sandoval and the Sandoval family for sharing this photo of Jose F. Archuleta and Maria Montoya Archuleta. And this is, they were early residents of the Jemez Springs. Probably, I don't know if Jose was the original settler or as maybe his father in the 1850s or 60s or earlier, but they were here into the late 1800s, and many descendants from them are related. Many of the people that are here today, still the families that are here today, are related to the Archuletas. So, for example, the Sandovals have direct lineage, and the Montoyas and the Cart family and the Garcias and others were through cross marriages and intermarriages among the family. They lived in Jemez Springs, and they were really heavily involved in the Presbyterian Church, which I'll talk about here later. This is a very interesting map of Jemez Springs. It's a hand-drawn map somewhere around 1907. This map was drawn about the time that the San Diego land grant was being partitioned, divided, and sold. I'm gonna talk about that at the very end, but it's a very important map because it shows where people were living and what their parcels of land. These are basically all these little squares with numbers in them and names are the little ranchos, the little farms right along the river, the creek here, that were owned by the people. And you'll see some names like up here at the top, there's Archuleta, and then Otero. So the Oteros by this time had bought a big chunk of land. And then the Abuselman, this little crowded space right here has a lot of different parcels in it, and that includes the village center. So this one that says Otero, where I'm sitting in the library, is right about here, right there at the southern end of that Otero property. Right down here at the bottom, there's also, so I can't see it on this image. Oh yeah, Francisco Perea. He had some land down there. He also had some land right here in the village area. So this is very helpful to know who was living where and what they owned at the time. It has to do with the San Diego land grant, which I'll tell you at the end. Here's another photograph from the Sandoval family, from Raymond, showing Juliana and Juan. And so Juliana was a daughter of Jose and Maria. And so that's how the Sandovals are linked to the Archuletas. And there was another gentleman by the name of Emiterio Archuleta. He was the brother of Juliana. And Emiterio was very involved in the 1880s with the Presbyterian Church, and he was very directly involved in the acequias here in Jemez Springs. Then there was a tragedy in the Archuleta family. This story is told by Townshend, who I'll mention here in a moment, who visited Jemez Springs. A story told to him by Emiterio. He said that the Navajos had killed a couple of the sons of the Archuleta family on the mesas to the west of Jemez Springs. And I'm not sure when that happened, but I'm guessing it might have been in the 1850s, before 1864, but I don't know. So it was kind of a dangerous place in the mid 1800s to live here. This is the oldest photograph of the village area that I know of. Again, it's a Cook Bass and Robinson image. And I think these guys were standing up on top of what's now known as the Laughing Lizard. You can see actually a little bit of construction boards right here. I think maybe they're up on the roof and they're looking north. And what you're seeing is the Presbyterian Church, and you're seeing the hotel. This is the hotel, which I'm going to tell you about, that was built by Perea and the Oteros. And this is the bathhouse. This structure right here is the original building of the bathhouse, which is right next door to the library here where I'm sitting. But there's other houses here that's very interesting to look at them and to try to figure out who is living where. That's where the map, the inholding map, is important to try to figure out who's living where and when. I don't know who is living. There's this little house over here by the bathhouse. It has some chili ristras hanging on the front there. I don't know who's living there. This house right here that is directly across the road, this would be where Highway 4 runs right here. This house on the left was, I'm pretty sure, is Jose and Maria Archuleta's house. And the reason I know that is that they gave the land for the church. They donated the property for the church to be built in 1880, 1881. And in the title for the church, it describes the location of Jose and Maria's house, and I think that's theirs. There is another house here behind the church. You can barely see some chimneys peeking over the roof of the church there. And that's about where the Los Ojos bar is now. It might be a little bit further north. Like if you look in the parking lot just immediately north of Los Ojos, you'll see an old wall in the hillside there. I think that's that structure there. That might have been more Archuleta, more of the Archuleta family living there. Perhaps that's where Emiterio lived. I don't know for sure. And then of course here's the hotel, which I'll be talking more about. So the other families that will come into play here, you see the Presbyterian Church. It was built in probably started building in 1879 or 1880, and then it was dedicated in 1881. That's when the Shields family moved from Jemez Pueblo up to Jemez Springs. So Dr. Shields, the Reverend Dr. Shields, was a physician who came as a missionary to Jemez Pueblo in 1878. There was a smallpox outbreak going on in the late 1800s there, and it killed many people in the Pueblo. And he was there, and the missionaries were there to help. But he moved the whole family from Jemez Pueblo to Jemez Springs when the church was built, and they lived in Jemez Springs then. And their descendants are the Adams family, who lived for a long time here in the valley and still have some descendants who own property here and live here occasionally. Amy Adams Green, for example. Hi, Amy, if you're on listening to this. And so this family has lived in a long time in the valley. And they played a role in a number of the changes and developments here over time. Here's the Reverend picture on the left, and later in the life. So here's another picture now. I'm going to bring in the hotel people who came in probably about 1879, 1880. These investors, Mariano Otero really being the main one, he came in and began to buy properties here in the Jemez Valley. And they built a big hotel. And that's the hotel that you see off there in the distance, in the midground. I'm going to zoom in. You can see this is the hotel right there in the middle. Okay. So they came in and they developed this hotel because they believed there was going to be a big rush of tourism. Incidentally, this photo is later. I think it's about maybe late 1890s. It's before the Busselman House is built. So the Busselman House is not there. That cottonwood tree is probably the giant cottonwood tree that was cut that used to hang over the road right by the Los Ojos bar. Notice the church, they changed the roof. The roof angle is completely 90 degrees from the way it was before. And this was at one point the Archuletas, and then it was a mercantile or a merchandise of some sort. But the investors, Otero and Perea, came in here to build the hotel. Why did they do that? Well, at the same time, right at 1880, there was a tourist boom going on elsewhere in the western U.S. Yellowstone National Park had been established, and they were the hot springs, and they built a big hotel there, giant hotel there for tourists. People wanted to come and soak in the hot spring, see the beautiful landscape, go fishing, go hunting. And so there was kind of a tourist thing going on. Over in Las Vegas, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe built this amazing hotel in 1881, the Montezuma Hotel, and they were sure they were going to get a lot of business. They had 200 rooms in that hotel. And just to show how intent they were to try to make this a going operation, that hotel burned in 1881, and they rebuilt it and the next year, and then it burned again in 1885. So the current hotel, which almost burned up recently at a wildfire, that's the third one on that site. But it hosted, Presidents U.S. Grant and Roosevelt and many other people. So at the time, there was this thinking, well, we can make money. People want to go on tourism. So they came to Jemez Springs and they built a hotel in Jemez Springs. And Otero was a very ambitious. They came from a very wealthy family, a very politically connected family. His cousin was a governor of the territory. He was a territorial representative himself. They had made a lot of money in sheep and other mercantilism in Santa Fe and Las Vegas areas. And he came over here and moved his family over here. And they built this hotel. He bought up, at the same time, he bought up the Baca land grant, the Baca location land grant. So he was the owner of the Baca location as well. And then he started buying lands here in Jemez Springs. Right. Okay, here's just a little view of that hotel. So this is the great hotel that was built by Otero and Perea, who is, I believe, another investor and a partner in this whole operation to build this hotel. And so this photograph is a Cook Bass and Robinson photo again from 1884, and you can see zoom in the hotel there. The west wing, I don't think has a roof on it yet, so it's not finished. This hotel, I did some tree ring dating for the Bodie. It's now on the Bodie Manda property, and I dated some timbers from the floorboards in that, and it was definitely was built in 1881. So here you're seeing it at 3 years later, and it's not completed, but they're working on it, right? So it was a more than a dozen rooms, and it was right next to the hot spring, so they could host people up here. And they established a stage line. So they're running stage line for tourists from Bernalillo coming up through San Ysidro and Jemez Pueblo, and also a stage line that went up the Rio Grande to Bland, to the old mining town in Bland, and over the mountain to another hotel that Otero built, which I'll talk about here in a minute. That's the Hot Springs, the Hot Springs Hotel up in Sulphur Valley. So they built the bathhouse. This is an old image of the bathhouse that Otero and Perea built. and they established their stage line, and they were having tourists. They started getting tourists up here. Now, what I forgot to mention was that the other reason they really thought there was going to be a lot of tourism up here was that there was not just rumor, but discussion and plans for building a railroad from Bernalillo to Jemez Springs. They were going to build a railroad line directly to Jemez Springs. So the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe had a plan for that, and it fell through for various reasons. And then one of their subsidiaries actually also planned to build it, and it fell through. So the railroad was never built. But at this time, in the late 1870s, early 1880s, they were still thinking that there was going to be a railroad. And if that had ever happened, you can imagine it would have been it would have been the tourist mecca that they were hoping it would be. But they had the stage. That's all they had, the stage. You can imagine the difficulty of riding the stage from Bernalillo was all day through the sandy area there by Zia. And then here, this advertisement, newspaper ad in Albuquerque of 1889, they're talking about leaving Bernalillo on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and then they go all day to Bland, right? So that's like going to like Peña Blanca, Cochiti, all the way up rugged road to Bland. And the next day they go over the Caldera Rim and go all the way over to San Antonio, via San Antonio, and down to the Sulphur Springs, where Otero had another hotel. That would be a long trip. So see the names of hotels on the left here. The Stone Hotel, I believe that is the name that the hotel built by Perea and Otero was named. And then there was the Block Hotel, which I'll mention. And then the Sulphur Hot Springs Hotel up there, northeast of La Cueva. And then the Miller Hotel, the La Esperanza, and the Rancho Rea. I'm going to talk about all of these except for the Rancho Rea, which is a story by itself. And it actually is a little bit later. It's like 1920s and 30s. This is a picture of the Sulphur Springs stage stop. And for a long time, I thought this might be in Jemez Springs, and it might still be, but I've never been able to match this hillside with the hillside here right behind the bathhouse or the Fitzgerald Park. It might be, but I can't see the match. It might also be this stage might have been over by Peña Blanca or somewhere, but you can imagine they had to have quite a support system to have horses pulling stages all the way up the Rio Grande Valley and over the mountains. Here's the hot spring resort at Sulphur Springs around 1900. Not a very good photograph. See a man standing over here. You ever been over there? It's now in the Valles Caldera. It's kind of a blasted looking area. There are like boiling mud pots there and hot springs. But the building here you can see on the left was a hotel, and it was there until the 1970s or so, I believe. It burned down. So it was there, got a rundown ruin until not too long ago. And that was, and also, by the way, this location is where Otero was mining sulfur. So he had an ongoing sulfur mine. They were digging out sulfur, which is important for gunpowder and matches and all sorts of things. And they were mining it as a product and hauling it in freight wagons down the Jemez Valley. So they were doing this around 1900. I'm going to just quickly mention this guy. I'm showing pictures of him and talking about him, and I'll show more pictures from him. This is Richard Baxter Townsend, and very interesting guy. He was a British adventurer. He came to Colorado and built and started a ranch. He sold that ranch, and then he bought a freight wagon and came down to Jemez Pueblo and became a trader for a very short while. And then he moved up here to Jemez Springs. As best I can tell, this is about 1876, 7, around there, the mid 1870s. Okay, and he describes Jemez Springs in some detail and all sorts of stories about penitentes in Cañon and a murder. His partner was murdered, possibly here in Jemez Springs. It's quite a story. It's in this Tenderfoot in New Mexico. So this guy, goes back to England, returns to England, and he becomes a scholar, a classic scholar at Oxford, for crying out loud. And he writes articles the rest of his life about his adventures in the West. And he came back to Jemez Springs in 1903, and he brought a camera. And so I have a number of great photographs that he took in 1903. And his 1903 visit is described in this other book, the last memories of the tenderfoot. I hope this is in the library. This is a great book to check out in the from the library. Here's one of his photographs. So the first one we saw when we went to Oxford looking for his pictures. This is a 6-horse team pulling a freight wagon up over the west end of Swetnam. So you can imagine how rough it was to get over the western end before they blasted it. This photograph, you can see a wagon down here. They've unhooked the team, the 2-horse team from this wagon, and connected it onto this 4-horse team. So they have a 6-horse team to get this rugged, get this wagon with a heavy freight load of some equipment, looks like mining equipment, up over the top. So this is the current view, standing on top of Swetnam, looking down. This is approximately where this picture was taken as the road went up and over the west end. And this is another photograph of the freight wagon going over. You see they have the 6 horses struggling over the rough road, rough, rocky, narrow road. There's 2 guys standing here trying to steady the horses to get over the road. And I'm guessing this might be mining equipment going to the sulfur mine up there at Sulphur Valley. That's just a guess. It sort of looks like, some kind of heavy equipment. But this was a bottleneck for a long time, a rough part of the road to get beyond Swetnam. It's a great pity that they blasted it instead of building a road around it or over it. That's another story. So Francisco Perea, I mentioned him. He was the other investor who came in with Otero to build the hotel and manage the hotel. Perea ended up being the manager. So this guy is a very interesting fellow, famous really in New Mexico. He had been a Union Army colonel in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he fought in the 1863 battle at Glorieta Pass. All right. And then after that, he was a territorial representative in Washington, D.C., and he became a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. So there are stories and newspaper accounts of multiple exchanges and meetings between Lincoln and Perea. They had a very funny interacting relationship. And then he was present at Ford's Theater when Lincoln was assassinated. So Perea, by 1880, I think he's in his late 50s, and he sort of moves here to Jemez Springs as a retirement place, but also to run the hotel that he's a part-time investor with Perea. And he was associated with Otero through marriage. So Francisco was married to Dolores Otero, and they had 18 children, most of whom died as infants. But he moved here with his family, and you can see this ad from 1881 in an Albuquerque newspaper saying accommodations for guests at the Springs under the personal management of Colonel Francisco Perea. And notice, acknowledged to be the finest on the continent, the famous Jemez Hot Springs. So they were up here running the hotel and running the stage and trying to get tourists in here. So another connection here, this is a connection with the Presbyterians. So Francisco Perea's brother was the Reverend Jose Inez Perea. And Jose Perea was the first ordained New Mexican Presbyterian minister. So he was an elder Presbyterian minister and active in missionary activities in northern New Mexico in the 1880s. The Presbyterians were establishing churches in many of the villages in northern New Mexico. And this is a few notes right here from a meeting discussing establishing the Presbyterian church in the Jemez Valley. And they met on August 29th of 1878. And then in September, a group of 3 reverends went to Jemez Pueblo, Sheldon Jackson and Reverend Shields and Jose Perea. They went there and they started the mission at Jemez Pueblo, right? So then later, this was in 1878, and just 2 or 3 years later, they're building the hotel up here, and his brother is moving to Jemez Springs. So then Shields decides to move to Jemez Springs too, and I think it's all related. There's this development of Jemez Springs, and people are moving there, and there's Presbyterians moving there. So the Pereas were all Presbyterians, and so were the Oteros, and they're all, by the way, Republican, staunch Republicans, Union supporters from the Civil War, and so it's kind of the small world of folks getting together and moving to Jemez Springs in anticipation of a boom time. So here's some photographs. I just have a number of photos Here you can see it's built. They have the hotel is built with a roof on it, and there's the bathhouse and the gazebo. Over the years, the hotel changed hands. In 1904, Mariano Otero died suddenly, and the heirs began to sell off the properties. And so I'll be talking about that. It comes into play with the San Diego land grant in a moment. But there's a number of evidences of changes of names, changes of people managing it through time. This is 1902, and somebody named Corcoran was running the hotel. Here's a picture around 1900. By the way, the west wing of the hotel no longer exists. So currently, the central peaked roof is still there, and then there's like one or two more rooms off to the west, and this wing is gone. I believe it was washed away in the 1941 flood or the 1958 flood, or both. There's actually some newspaper accounts of some of the places getting washed away up here in those big floods. So today, the hotel just extends from right about here to the east. And now, of course, it's in the Bodhi, and they've done some renovations, some wonderful renovations of the hotel. Here's from a view from the hotel looking south toward the bathhouse. And over here on the left in those trees is the Busselman house. So this photo is probably early 1900s. And you can see the gazebo over here. Here's a close-up view. You can see the gazebo, which I think this is still in the same place, or maybe it's been moved slightly. There might be an older mound out there, and this gazebo now has moved to a different one. I'm not entirely sure, but these structures, these stone buildings right here are now within the current bathhouse. And that's going to be one of the oldest structures still in Jemez Springs so far that we know for sure. It's probably from the 1870s, if not the 1860s. Here's a picture from Townsend, the Oxford scholar guy who came back in 1903, of the gazebo and these girls. It's kind of a delightful picture, I think, of these girls with their toes in a little pool of water by the gazebo. I asked some of the Busselman family members if these were possibly any of the daughters of Moses Busselman, and they said no. So I don't know who they are. They could see a couple girls here in fancy dresses and a hat, and then some other girls here not dressed so well. Anyway, who knows whose kids these are? Maybe they're the Pereas or the Oteros or some of the other local families here. If anybody knows or has any idea, I would love to hear. Here's a picture looking back again from the bathhouse. There's a lot of photographs showing this landscape and changes. Here's another Townsend picture, which I was able to match recently. A couple of burros riding on what's now Highway 4, and this is the hotel. This is the stone hotel over there. All right, so here's the modern view. This is exactly the same view, right? And so right about where this pedestrian sign is right where that burro is. And this structure back here is the hotel. And there's the modern Bodhi structure in front of it. So this is a little aside, but it kind of gives you a flavor of the interesting people and changes of people coming through the Jemez Valley at that time. And 1887, I just recently learned this, there was a very interesting group of people here. They were camped just south of Hummingbird Music Camp. They had a campsite there near one of the village ruins, the Jemez village ruins down on the valley floor. And it included John Wesley Powell and William Henry Holmes and the Stevensons, Matilda and James, and Samuel Pierpont Langley. So if you don't recognize these names, Powell was at this time the director of the U.S. Geological Survey. He was the famous major in the Union Army who lost his arm at Shiloh, and then he was the first party expedition to raft down the Colorado River in 1868, 1869. Then he rafted down again a few years later. Amazing guy, really visionary scientist, geologist, and very power broker guy in Washington, D.C. for many years. And then William Henry Holmes was one of the first archaeologists ever to work in the Southwest. He was also an accomplished artist, and he worked with geologists, famous geologists mapping the Grand Canyon. He later on was like the director of the National Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. The Stevensons were early ethnographers, anthropologists who visited almost all of the pueblos in the Southwest and took photographs. And Langley was the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He'd just been appointed. in 1887. So all these folks are camped for a month right there just below Hummingbird Music Camp. And here's a sketch from William Henry Holmes that he sent to his wife of their tent camp. So it was a big wall tent camp. These guys knew how to camp, you know. I mean, they had done expeditions all over the West, and they were Union Army veterans, and so they knew how to camp in style. And they had a big wall tent camp set up there, and they were mapping the ruins. They were doing horseback trips to the tops of the peaks and doing geology and archaeology and all sorts of stuff. But this is where my little speculation. So they're 3 miles north of the hotel that's being run by Francisco Perea, another Union man, Republican, who's running it, and Otero. And so my guess is that they were going down there for dinner and hot baths at the hotel 3 miles down the canyon. So they spent a month here, and there's lots of stories. I need to move on here, but they told stories of this trip in their journals and diaries that are really worth repeating at some point. One of them is a bear story. There's a grizzly bear. Holmes runs into a grizzly bear, and it almost scares his horse away down the valley. There's other stories of grizzly bears up here from the tourists that came up, and fishing stories in the newspapers. People were coming up here and visiting hot springs and hunting and exploring the ruins and so forth. One more thing on these early explorers. In 1879, the Stevensons, Matilda and James Stevenson, were up here, and they took this photograph, which is, I think, the oldest well-dated photo I know of from Jemez Springs. I'd be happy to hear if there's an older one, but this is well dated. We know it's by Hillers, who was a famous photographer. He was a photographer for John Wesley Powell on his second trip down the Colorado River. And those photos are exquisite. I mean, they're just so crystal clear. You can see the old mission and the arroyo in front of the mission, and you see all these figures. I'm going to zoom in. Here's a zoomed view. Actually, that's a colorized view. And then here's a zoom view of, I think this is Hillers, the photographer himself, posing down here in the arroyo. And then these two up here are Matilda and James. And sitting back here is, I think, John Miller, who is the Indian agent, and then he actually owned that property right there, and he built his hotel and house right across the road from the old mission church. So Matilda and James, just one more thing about them. They were here in 1879, so 8 years before the 1887 trip out here with Powell. They were here, and they were also traveling all over the pueblos, and Hillers was taking photographs, these great photographs of all the pueblos. And the Stevensons were collecting pottery and artifacts. They were paying for some of them, and whatever. They were collecting materials for the Smithsonian, which are in the Smithsonian now. And they were accused of stealing a pot from Zia Pueblo, from a kiva in Zia Pueblo, that has the sun symbol, the Zia sun symbol. I don't know the truth of what happened there. The long and short of it was that pot finally showed up about a decade ago in a private collection in Santa Fe, and it was repatriated to Zia. The original image showing the sun symbol that's on the flag, the New Mexico flag. But anyway, those are the Stevensons, Matilda and James, and probably Hillers. Here's another Hillers photo taken, no doubt, the same day or days, showing the old mission. And notice the house. There's a house built in there with an orno out in front. I think this, and there's actually a little stable area here for animals. I think this might have been Miller's house before he built across the road. So I'll come back to Miller here in a moment. So another hotel that got established right about the same time, the Oteros and the Pereas built their house. And then this guy, J.B. Block, he also bought property. What they were doing is they were buying the inholding pieces from land grant heirs along the valley bottom here. So they were buying these inholding ranchos along the river, and Otero bought a big chunk, several big chunks, and Block bought a big chunk, and Block built a hotel. J.B. Block built a hotel. And here's an old photograph of his hotel compound. And there's a couple of big buildings up there, and there was a barn, and there are like various outbuildings probably for their carriages, for the buggies that they're using to get the tourists around. You can see another building over here. This is actually a building that would be behind what is currently today the Laughing Lizard. This is one of my hobby horses, is to, here's a colorized version of that, is to rephotograph these locations to see what's still there and what's left. So these two structures are still there. And I think Billy Arrett lives in one of these, and then Bill Bergman and his wife live here in this one over here. I don't know other folks who live up here in these ones, but there are other folks still living there now. And here's a modern retake, not an exact retake of that view. The old barn, the wall of it here alongside the Bergman house is still there. And the Bill says that he thinks that wall, part of the wall of that barn is inside the house, is part of the walls of the current house structure. So there's Mr. Block with his buggy, where he probably was taking tourists to go up the valley to see, Soda Dam and Battleship Rock. That was the thing, to give the tourists a ride around and fishing. And here's a picture of them in their later years. And I think this photograph might be taken up there at one of the old houses. Now the Millers. So this is the other story. As I said, Miller was an Indian agent. He lived at Jemez Pueblo. He was actually a friend of this Townshend guy, this Britisher guy. And he moved to Jemez Springs with his family too, right around that time, late 1870s, early 1880s. He married Mary Strite Miller, who was a Presbyterian missionary. She came out to work with Dr. Shields. They got married and they had this son, Hugh. He lived his whole life here in Jemez Springs, except for he went to World War I. He was a soldier in World War I. But they lived there right next to the old mission, right? So this house over here on the left is the Miller house and their barn. And I think this might have been an older Miller house. I'm not sure. So this is their house. They lived there, and they used it as a hotel. It's sort of more like maybe a bed and breakfast. There were some upstairs rooms or something, and so people would stay there, and they sometimes referred to it as the Miller Hotel. And then he died. John Miller died, and Mary and her son Hugh ran this as a hotel for a while. So that's a picture of that house. And then we have photos of that from Townshend in 1903. I think he stayed with the Millers. Here's a picture of somebody is goat herding, goat herding right along Highway 4, right in front of the Millers' house, right? There's the Virgin Mesa right up above it. And here, this is a photo rematch of the Miller house and then the modern day Servants of the Paraclete building, which and I'm not sure, but it's possible that the current building that's there is actually the same structure that's been, covered in stucco, and it's been remodeled. I'm not sure if they're the same structures or not. It'd be very interesting to go examine some old timbers in here and see if it's the same building. It's in about the same location, same angle. Some of the windows seem like some of the same windows and doors and so on are the same ones, but I'm not sure if it's the same one. And then down from there, there's another building that you might recognize right across the bridge that was present in 1903. Here are these guys running cows up the road. Here's another view of that building, which probably that might have belonged to the Shields or the Millers. I'm not sure. There's another house down the road, which also the Adams family lived in later, but I'm not sure which house was the Shields house originally. This is a photo I just wanted to show. Townshend labeled this Reverend Shields and family. Unfortunately, it's not a good enough picture to see their faces, but it's a picture of them in front of. So they were neighbors. The Millers and the Shields were living right there, right next to the old mission church in those days. And then there's this hotel, the La Esperanza Hotel. So this one's a little bit later. It was probably built around 1900 or 1905 or somewhere after that time. And it was an interesting, it's advertised often in the newspapers in Albuquerque. They touted, electricity in the rooms by the 1920s. And they also had some hot springs somewhere nearby there they were using. The location of this one, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's about where the modern church is, right across from the old mission church. I think somewhere in there. It's not down in the valley. I think it was in this particular location. Maybe somebody can enlighten me about its location. Here's a postcard image of the inside the lobby of that La Esperanza ranch. Very cool, pelts on the wall, deer rack, a nice stone fireplace. They went bankrupt and were auctioned off sometime by 1930 or early 1930s. But like I said, it was kind of a going thing. Here's a 1928, front page Sunday paper spiel on go to the Jemez Springs this Sunday and delightful trip to La Esperanza Ranch and Hotel. And this is a picture of the La Esperanza Ranch. There's Soda Dam. And then there's a little advertisement right there and right here for La Esperanza. What's a little confusing to me is they refer to this as a stone hotel also. So I'm pretty sure the one built by Perea and Otero was the stone hotel, but this was another stone hotel that was built later. At least that's my interpretation at this point. Well, just a few more pictures. The changes that have occurred. Here's the modern view, and here's the old view of Jemez Springs, and you can see, the Abuzelman house here behind the tree. This, I think, is the old Abuzelman residence. And over in the far right corner, the Jemez, the hot sulfur baths. And then what's now today Laughing Lizard right here. And then this is the Block Hotel up here on the hill. Okay, let me zoom in on some of this. There's a repeat. Miguel and Dee Plena recently rephotographed for this perfectly. You can compare before and after. Here's the Abuzelman house right here, you see, and then here's the Block Hotel up here, right? And then the church, there's the Jemez, the Presbyterian church. These before and after photos are always fun. Here's a zoom in on the church, the Jemez Springs Presbyterian Church. And here's the Block Hotel up at the top. I think this is somebody standing right there in this photo. You can see other things. Here's the Laughing Lizard. There were buildings on all sides. There were downside between the church and Laughing Lizard was a building. Then there was this building that was in the parking lot now of the Laughing Lizard between Highway 4 Cafe. And there was this Palace Cafe. That's the one that was in that parking lot. Down the road there's the Presbyterian Church. So, just lots of old photographs. You can see many of these, by the way, on the history web pages here at the library. So the Abuzelmans, they were, of course, really important early settlers here that came in. They came. Moses Abuzelman was working over here as part of the Solomon and Abuzelman and Eunice family merchant organization out of Santa Fe. They had a mercantile here in Jemez Springs, I think sometime in the late 1890s. And he was traveling over here occasionally. And for many years, he had been a partner with Salmon there in Santa Fe with a dry goods store. And I believe Salmon purchased Abuzelman's share of that business, and Abuzelman acquired the mercantile in his name here in Jemez Springs, and they moved to Jemez Springs. This would be right around 1900, if I've got that right. And then they built their main house after 1900. You can see actually they had their first house here burned. This is a news story about the connected with the store that burned for a time. It was feared it would be lost, but it wasn't. I don't know if that was the big house that's there today or the one that was there before. But there's a number of photos, of course, of the Abuzelmans. And here you can see the store, and this looks like it's maybe what was is now the Laughing Lizard was at one time the Abuzelman store. And then inside, this is a picture of inside Los Ojos bar. Well, I don't know if this is in the current Los Ojos bar, but it was a bar of the Abuzelmans at that time before 1918. Here's a picture of the family, Moses Abuzelman. A very interesting history of this family, and Moses in particular had many adventures here running sheep, running into sheep thieves and being shot at one time. And then the family, of course, were involved in setting up many of the infrastructure here in the village, the electricity and the water, and played very important roles in Jemez Springs history throughout the 20th century. Pictures of the daughters. By the way, this is a very interesting book. These are daughters of Moses Abuzelman, and it's this book Los Arabes of New Mexico. And it's about the Lebanese and Syrian families. There were many who moved to New Mexico in that period and established mercantile stores, but also they were sheep and other businessmen doing work in New Mexico. There were important families that did a lot of development of New Mexico in those days. Oh, the Buzelmans also had their own bathhouse that they used as an operation, as a money-making operation. And that's the Hot Sulphur Springs bath. You can now see that ruin is still there next to Giggling Springs. And Tom Buzelman told the former owner of Giggling Springs that that was the original bathhouse location. And it might be, but I did some tree ring dating on this building, this old building, and it was built after 1891. So it could be that this was a rebuilt structure. If there was an older bathhouse there, it might have been washed away from a flood. And there were some big floods in the 1870s and 1880s through Amos Springs. So I'm not sure, there might have been an older bathhouse there, but this bathhouse is built after 1891, and it was run by the Buzelmans. So just a funny picture of the Buzelmans joyriding around Amos Springs in their touring cars. Is the tree in front of the big house. So this was early 1900s. And then I wanted to say briefly, I'm getting to the end here. Other folks coming in, the Forest Service arrived here probably about 1910 or so. They were doing our original surveys in 1904. But by 1932, they built this residence, which is still there, just across the arroyo from the old mission church. And incidentally, I grew up in that house. My dad was a district ranger here from 1964 to 1973, and so we lived in this house, and it's still there. But that was where, right across from this house, was this old one room office. Was the office for the Amos Ranger District. One room, and that's what my dad was in that office in 1964, and then the next year they built the new ranger station where the current ranger station is, which was just torn down. That 1965 ranger station was torn down, and we have a brand new ranger station that's just about to be dedicated. So just a little history of that. And at that time, the rangers were here, their families were here, many people were starting to work with the ranger district. I wanted to show this picture. It shows one of the few, or maybe the only picture I have, of Leonard Lewis. Leonard Lewis is number 16 over here on the far right. And he was the ranger here in the 1930s for a number of years. And sadly, he was killed in the line of duty. He was pulling a horse trailer up above Battleship Rock on the way to La Cueva with a truck, and the truck and the horse trailer went over the edge, and he was killed, and so was the horse. And he left a family of 9 children and a widow, and they lived in Amos Springs for many years thereafter. They still live there. The descendants of the Lewises are here today, including Amanda Lewis, who works here in the library, and other Lewis folks are still in the valley. And so they were early 1900s folks in this area too, and have been around since. So the last thing I wanted to say was about the land grant. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail on this. It's not enough time really to talk about it, but it's an interesting story and a sad story, one that was repeated across the Southwest, where there were early community land grants that were established, where people had their properties, their private properties or individual properties along the river, but everything outside away from that was community, and it was to be used in a communal way. So for timber, for firewood, for grazing, everybody would use the community land. Well, all of this was lost in 1904, and what happened was, again, to make a long story short, Otero and Perea, the hotel guys, and Block, they came in and they bought up pieces of land. They bought up some parcels of these individual parcels along the river. And then when Mariano Otero died in 1904, his family said, oh, okay, we own the community land grant, and we can run sheep and we can cut timber, we can do anything. So there was a big fight. The Oteros were then asserting their rights over all of the timber and all of the grazing on the community land grant. And you can imagine how the local people felt. I mean, here's this big guy, this patron, he's got the Baca and now he wants to take over the San Diego land grant. So they took him to court to try to see, okay, well, how much is he due? How much of the percentage of the community land grant does he actually have access to? And this lawyer came in by the name of Alonzo McMillan, and he offered to represent the local folks. He said, well, I'll represent you, but I get 50% of any proceeds. If there's any sales or any money that comes out of this, I get 50% of it. That was his fee, 50% lawyer fee. So as soon as it goes to court, making a long story short, the judge says you have to sell all of it. Sell all of the community land grant has to be sold. And Otero gets 20% and everybody else gets 80%. So then it went up for auction, one day auction, and a representative by secret of McMillan bought the land grant. So there was one person who was associated with McMillan, the lawyer for the plaintiffs. He buys the land grant for 45 cents an acre. It doesn't hardly anything. And then the lawyer who's bought the grant, he gets half of that back because he's got half of the fees from the recipients. So he gets half of it back. McMillan, he gets half of it back. Then a few years later, McMillan sells his interest, his 80% interest in the land grant to the White Pine Timber Company, and they came up and logged the timber over there by Guadalupe. But he sold it for the equivalent of $12 million in 2022 dollars. And in the end, the land grant heirs here got very little money, very tiny amount of money. So it was kind of a corrupt deal, really. And sadly, this whole thing is a sad thing that the community lands were taken, and it's been one that was repeated over and over in northern New Mexico. Eventually, they cut the timber over there, and they went bankrupt. The railroad went away, and that land ultimately was sold to the Forest Service. So now most of the community land grant is managed by the government, the U.S. government. Last couple images here, just to change subject just for a moment, but the Navajos were coming through here still as late as 1903. Here's a couple Navajos on horseback, according to Townsend's photograph. And here's a retake of that photo over by the carts. And then here's another one of my favorite repeat photos. The old mission church looking down the valley, and look at this guy. He's standing up on top of he's standing up on top of the bell tower. And then you can hardly see anything because of the cottonwood bosque. But the houses on down through here. And then this is actually a view from my deck in Area 3. We live on Ponderosa Drive, looking down the valley, and you can see my neighbor's house here, and you can see Shefa's house, and then you can see Area 2 is over here, and we're in Area 3. And I just wanted to say that, I'm mindful studying this history that I live on lands that used to belong to someone else. And in fact, the lands were taken unjustly and corruptly in the case of the San Diego land grant. And then, of course, before the Spanish land grantees, there was the Jemez people here. And, they lost these lands and were forced out of this landscape as well. And so I think it's at least important we acknowledge and we understand this history. We understand where we stand and where it came from. And we try to make amends toward the future. And I'm not, making any political statement here. I'm just saying that I think it behooves all of us to at least acknowledge this history and to learn it. I'm one for learning history, even the ugly sides of history, even the bad sides of our U.S. history and our local history. And so this kind of recognition has been kind of more and more like the universities are starting to do these land acknowledgement statements. Here's one from a department at my university, my old university in Arizona. And it's just recognizing where the land came from. And many of the land grant universities, by the way, their lands and the money for the universities came from formerly indigenous lands. And so there you see these land acknowledgement statements are commonly posted on many websites. And just a statement about why it's important for us to recognize who lived here before and recognize the injustices that were done in the past, and going forward, see what we can do to be more equal and more fair and more just in our treatment of the land and our neighbors in the future. So off my soapbox on that one, but it's worth remembering who came before. Finally, there's so much more Jemez history, and I just put forward what I know, and all history is kind of is what we know right now, and maybe there are more facts will come forward, and I'm happy to be corrected and learn new things. So if anybody has something to share with me or some correction you need to make about some of the history facts that I put forward, I'd really love to hear it. So, and you can visit the JemezValleyHistory.org website, which is the hosted and maintained by the Jemez Springs Public Library. It's a really fantastic resource, and it's constantly growing. You can go there and see a lot of photographs and learn a lot more history there. So visit there. Okay. I don't know what time it is, but maybe there's a little time for, yeah, I've gone on pretty long here. So more than an hour, but yeah, okay. So if there is any questions, I probably could take a few questions. Okay, and if you ask a question, you can turn your audio and your camera on. And then what? Oh yeah, let me get out of my screen here. Stop screen share. Yeah, I got it. Okay. Okay, any questions? Okay, maybe not. Okay. All right, any questions? If not, we'll thank everybody again for supporting the library. And there will be a recording of this at some point, Janet. So there'll be a recording of this, and you'll receive a copy of that, or you can get a copy or a link to that recording at some point. Okay, thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Okay. So shall I leave?
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah,
Thank you, Tom.
you bet.